Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the time when I usually talk about my art progress from the previous day, but I don't think my uh, line work yesterday was so great. But I would like to talk about some of the reading I did last night. I am reading about the history of comic strips, and we are in the 1910s and beginning in the 1920s, and there is a great deal of innovation in this time period. And I really think this is a time worth studying. Unfortunately, this book doesn't have the best reproductions of comics of that period. This is just a general overview of that time period, but I still think there is a lot to learn. So last time we read about in the 1910s how comic strips were becoming a mainstream of middle class life. And like we talked about some of the strips before, and now we're coming to this new generation of strips, and I want to point out one called Toots and Casper. Now, I don't know anything about this strip aside from what we have here, but I would like to point out the art style here. So we have a very cute style here for the young wife, and a cute style for the baby. And this is something that I think nowadays would remind us of Betty Boop. This is before the time of Betty Boop. Betty Boop is probably about 10 years away from this. But nowadays we would almost call this a chibi style. It's not exactly the same thing as a chibi style, but it does show that many of the same tendencies that we have in comics today have been around for a long time. Now, one thing I find interesting about this comic is that there was a storyline in which Toots, that's the young wife, is going to get her hair bobbed, and let's see, he included a large panel one day showing Toots modeling 8 different bobs, including the boyish bob, the Dutch girl bob, and the vamp bob. When Casper yelled, as the husband, "I won't let you bob your hair," Toots, in an obvious aside to the audience, replied, "What's your idea of the best way to have one's hair bobbed?" And then readers sent in their suggestions. In other words, there was a reciprocal relationship between the readers of the comic strip and the artist. That's something that we associate today more with social media, but I wonder whether webcomics have caught up on this idea. I think it is a very interesting idea to have a comic strip where the audience is given some limited freedom in the future. What should my hair look like? And then a month later, we'll see the results of that. Now, I'm sure other comic strips have followed this pattern, but it's fascinating to see that even in the 1910s or early 1920s, that this was already a thing. I think that's just really interesting. Another thing, this comic strip is called Jerry and Job by Walter Hoban. I want to point out the cross-hatching here. This is some very excellent cross-hatching. Nowadays we don't really have a lot of cross-hatching in comic books or such because we would it'll either be in color or we might just have some tone paper, usually digitally made, but some people use tone paper. And I do think cross-hatching has its own unique charm, and it can do some things that tone can't. I mean, for one thing, the cross-hatching is of the same design as the characters and the words, so this is a very harmonious look. One thing I've noticed today is when we use a font for the letters and we have digital cross-hatching, it looks very, well, it can be very disjointed in a way. All right, Percy in Stageland, we have an early robot. But what's interesting here is that the word robot did not exist yet. So this creature was called a mechanism man. But he was what we would now call a robot. And the mechanism man owes some of his design, of course, to the Tin Woodman of The Wizard of Oz. In the book, he is a Tin Woodman. In the classic film, he's the Tin Woodsman. I'm guessing the S probably came from there were generations of stage plays between the book and the classic film, and at some point, some of that seeped into the film. The film, in many ways, owes more to the stage plays than the book. All right, and we have, of course, an early Crazy Cat. This is 1922. Many of the Crazy Cats were in black and white. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to read the text of this example. I do have a book of color Crazy Cats from about 1941 and 42, so we'll be able to study Crazy Cat a lot more at that point. Finally, as we're closing out the 1910s, a very curious thing happened. There were two Katzenjammer Kids comic strips, and it's because of some shenanigans with the newspapers. As I've mentioned before, a lot of comic strip origins come from the feud between Pulitzer and Hearst, Hearst being the model for Citizen Kane. And one paper owned the copyright, but the artist moved to a different paper. I don't remember which one. It doesn't matter. So the original artist was working for one paper, and then you kind of get the idea. So rival papers with rival Katzenjammer Kids, and as when the Great War came about, the Katzenjammer Kids became less and less Germanic, and one of the comics actually ended up giving them Irish names, because it's okay to make fun of the Irish at all times. Now I just began the next chapter, which is the 1920s, Flappers and Philosophers. And my word, there were a lot of flappers in comic strips at this time period. And some of these comic strips were made by Chick Young, who eventually settled on his most famous flapper, Blondie, and that comic strip we will talk about later. Blondie is an interesting mixture of things. But these flapper strips, from what I can tell, are not so different from some of the girls manga, I guess shoujo manga of today, in the sense of being about relationships and about fashion and sort of this domestic adventure, rather than being about gags and vaudeville humor, as we saw in previous comic strips. So anyway, I think the 1920s are going to be a very interesting period for comic strips. Now, before I go, I want to point out that book doesn't reproduce the comic strips very well, but I do have another resource. I have some stamps which were issued in 1995, which was the 100th anniversary of the Yellow Kid, and these stamps represent really the classic characters. I would say by about 1950. I think Alley Oop is the 1950s. So I think all of these are basically before then. I'm not sure about Brenda Storm. Maybe she's in the 1960s. That seems a little bit more recent. But really, this is the first half century of comics, and so these were considered the classic ones. And so far, we've met the Yellow Kid with his yellow journalism shirt, the Katzenjammer Kids, Little Nemo. I've got a whole book of Little Nemo, so we will look at him in depth later. We have not met Bringing Up Father. Of course, Crazy Cat, Rube Goldberg, and remember, his Rube Goldberg inventions were just one part of his cartooning life. He actually did a lot of strips before that. I haven't mentioned Toonerville Folks, but yeah, there they are. And we will eventually meet Gasoline Alley, Barney Google. Barney Google with his Google eyes, that was a hit song. That horse Sparkplug, that's where Charles Schultz gets his nickname Sparky. We have not met Little Orphan Annie, which is still going on today. We have not met Popeye. We'll talk a lot about Popeye. He's very important. Blondie, that's Chick Young. Dick Tracy, well, if you've ever read a Batman comic strip, then comic book, you've probably read Dick Tracy, because the whole Rogues Gallery thing of Dick Tracy was an inspiration for a lot of the villains in Gotham City. Alley Oop, we'll talk about that later. Nancy is very important. People underestimate how important Nancy is. Flash Gordon, one of the most important comics ever. Um, we'll talk hours and hours about Flash Gordon. Lil Abner, super important. Terry and the Pirates, great comic adventure. Prince Valiant, the artistry of Prince Valiant is wonderful. Yes, we'll talk about Prince Valiant later. I don't really know a lot about Brenda Starr. Now, the thing about these stamps, this was a commemorative event. I I don't know how I got those stamps because I have a book which commemorates these stamps, and I don't think I bought these at a bookstore. I think I might have gotten these at the post office. Or, in other words, I think there was some type of form that I had to fill out at the post office and pay some money to get this commemorative book and stamps. So this was the original package. Came and see it was made by the United States Postal Office, and it came with this attractive book and stamps. So one set of stamps was in plastic, and the other set of stamps I just put in a plastic sheet to save. So this book I can use as a way to show you some of this artwork a little better than what I have before. And I'll probably go online and find some good examples of these comics. But just so that you know what I mean when I talk about some of these things, like this. Okay, so look at the Cats and Jammer Kids. I mean, that's difficult to express in black and white. I don't want to show everything in this book. This is really quite wonderful. The colors and the designs and everything. I mean, look at the Yellow Kid. 1895, the beginning of comics, right here. Is this a Buster Brown in Yellow Kid? I'll have to read this later because the word is it's very small and I can't read it through the camera. But this is just, oh, Little Nemo is always just so beautiful. I've got a whole Little Nemo calendar, so I can show you some of these things. Oh, Rube Goldberg. Oh, just look at that. Look at that. Look at the line work. It's just beautiful. Okay, we'll have to look at this later. But I just wanted to bring this up as a resource that we can use to examine these early comic strips. Alright, I've talked enough about these. I could go on forever. And I guess I'll just have to talk to you later when I actually draw something that's a little better. Goodbye.